a very friendly group of people. And at that time, they were talking about starving children in Africa. Every night on the news, these very, very distressed children. It brought us, a lot of sympathy. And my comment during one of our sessions was, look, you guys are talking about starving, suffering people. Why don't we all find out what it's like to be hungry so we can relate to them, have a little empathy? And what I did is I got half of the congregation to go along with me. And we decided I, of course, was the instigator, decided that what we ought to do is we ought to not eat just for a weekend. Just a few hours, a couple of days, but 48 hours, that would be enough. Well, we did that. We all agreed just to drink water for the weekend. And Friday night was no big deal. I thought, I'm feeling great. Saturday morning, still, everything was pretty good. And by Saturday afternoon, all I could think about was food. By Saturday evening, I had no more money problems. I wasn't worried about nuclear war. I wasn't having any spouse problems. I didn't have any problem on my mind except one. That was to do something about this hunger. It was intense. It was overwhelming. Just in 24 hours. I mean, could you go without food for 24 hours? Well, I'm going to ask you to do it for a little more than that, maybe 40 hours. So Sunday morning came along, and I could just hardly wait to get together with the group because we were going to finally eat on Sunday afternoon. And Mary fixed a meal typical of what the children would be having in Africa if they had food available. She made a green lettuce salad, a lentil stew, flatbread, and rice. I want to tell you, for those of who participated in this experiment, that was the best meal we ever had. If you want to learn about hunger and how powerful it is, you can do it in 36 hours. All you will be thinking about is hunger, the pain of hunger. I seriously think you ought to try it if you're not sick and you're not a kid. It'd be an education that would change your life. During World War II, lots of people suffered starvation, particularly Western Europe. This occurred through many parts of the world at different times, so it's nothing necessarily unique, but it was a time that at least our parents experienced during World War II, and because of the lack of food, people were desperate. And they would get whatever food they could find, and what they found were primarily foods that we eat on the McDougall diet. Interesting. They're primarily vegetable foods, nuts, seeds, potatoes. Well, one of the things that they're eating in Holland, which was kind of interesting, was they were living on tulip bulbs. Those are underground storage organs, tulip bulbs. That was the main source of calories. Well, at that particular time, a fellow by the name of Ancel Keys, he developed the K rations, which is the food. They still feed people. They were just feeding K rations in a part of the world where they're having a lot of disasters right now. During World War II, it was K rations. Ancel Keys, K rations. Now, Ancel Keys did the 7-country study, which is the foundation for us believing that animal foods are the source of many of our illnesses, in particular heart disease. Ancel Keys did that. Ancel Keys, of course, is a very famous man, and he took his talents, and what he decided to do was to set up an experiment called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. And they took over some community grounds, fairgrounds, and he set up this experiment to learn about hunger, to find out what it was about, so that we could better deal with it. At that particular time, World War II, and in the future, Ancel Keys decided to do that. So he was able to get 36 conscientious objectors, 36 young men who didn't want to kill, but they wanted to serve their country. And so they volunteered for this experiment. It was an 11-month experiment where they changed the amount of food that they were allowed to consume. It was called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. 11 months. The intention was men to lose 25% of their normal body weight. Now, pay attention to this carefully because there's some figures here I'd like you to try and remember. The first 3 months, they fed them what typically these men would be eating as far as calories are concerned, about 3,200 calories a day. Then they cut their food intake in half. And now for the next 6 months, they had to eat half the calories. They were under a condition of semi-starvation. They were taking in 1,570 calories a day for 6 months. And then they had 2 months of refeeding. Most of the men were put back on food slowly, but there was a small group of 12 that were told, you can eat whatever you want, eat as much as you want. All right, so we have starting out with 3,200 calories, cutting those calories in half during this period of semi-starvation that lasts for 6 months, and then a refeeding period. Now, I want you to note that the semi-starvation period, they weren't starving. They weren't in a condition called ketosis, where your appetite is suppressed. They were just semi-starving, where you have the pain of hunger. All they thought about was food. They read cookbooks. They read stories about food. They dreamed about food. They had daydreams about food. They watched movies about food. They read cookbooks, recipes. All they could think about was food. They guarded their food with their elbows. They wouldn't let anybody get close to whatever they had on their plate. They would lick their plates to get the last crumb of food. There were some people in the lunchroom that weren't eating like they were. And these people who were non-participants, they got really upset with them, especially when they saw them wasting food. This went on for 6 months, half the calories. It was so severe, they lost their interest in sex. They were no longer interested in women. They developed anxiety and depression. They got stomach problems like headaches and trouble sleeping. You can see the physical changes. Profound loss of weight. One person lost 50 pounds. They would chew gum. They would stick three sticks of gum in their mouth, and they would chew rapidly just because that mechanical sensation would give them some type of satisfaction, not nearly comparable to satisfying hunger. They rummaged through garbage cans looking for food. They played with their food. Increased the amount of spices and salt. It was a tough time, to say the least, for these men. 6 months, semi-starvation. Now, most of the men, all except for 12, so that'd be 24, they were carefully refed, slowly refed. But they took 12 of these men and they said, look, go out and eat whatever you want. Eat as much as you want. No restrictions. And they did something called the Overshoot phenomena. They ended up gaining more weight than they originally started at. And this happens in typical starvation populations, is when food is reintroduced to the population, they eat to the point where they almost kill themselves. Can't stop. Anyway, they gained 10% more of their weight than they'd started with. But even though they replenished the fat, that didn't stop the overshooting effect. They had to replace the tissue of the liver and the spleen and the muscles, which we call non-fatty tissue, before they returned back to their normal weights. So the hopefully you learn from your weekend that you're going to experiment with of not having any food, and you'll learn from the conscientious objectors under the direction of Ancel Keys, the fact that the hunger drive is intense. You can't deny it. If you would likely be busy doing something else and forget to eat and not bother, and you would starve to death. It has to be that intense. It's one of the three basic drives that keeps us alive. Myth, common myth. Suppressing my hunger drive with diets and drugs is my best hope. Diets and drugs. I mean, that's what you've tried in the past, or your friends or relatives, diet and drugs. The diets that have been popular for so long. Well, the first diet that's been popular for so long is the starve yourself diet. And that's the semi-starvation that we just talked about. That's called portion control. That's called having willpower and limiting the amount of food you eat. These are people that would eat paint off the refrigerator. They're so hungry. That's dieting. But short of dieting, the way that diets take care of that powerful hunger drive is you go on a low-carb diet. Keto diets, they call them these days. They used to call them the Atkins diet. Some people call it the carnivore diet. I've heard doctors say that you should eat an animal from its nose to its tail and everything in between. Anyway, they're all low-carb diets. They take the carbohydrate out, not just sugar, but potatoes and rice and corn, and you're left with fat and protein. Low-carb diet. The body loves carbohydrate. Your basic metabolism is called glycolysis. That's burning sugar, glucose. The low-carb diets popularized 150 years ago, but Atkins popularized low-carb diet about 50 years ago. Bacon, butter, and brie, that's what he asked you to eat, bacon, butter, and brie. And what happens is the body, because it doesn't have any sugar to burn, no glycogen, which is stored in the muscles and liver, you're not eating any carbohydrate. The body has to resort to something to stay alive, and so what it resorts to is burning fat, body fat, and food fat, the fat that you eat, the butter and the brie.